everyone, and welcome back to That UFO podcast. And very quickly, before I get into today's show, I just want to let people know this weekend, the 9th and 10th of August, the website, That UFO podcast, is going to be offline just while it gets a few bugs ironed out, and the new store is going to be up and ready as well. So thank you to Glenn, who's helping me out with that, dropping his name in there. I'm sure he won't mind. And also, you can pre-order the book, folks. If you're on YouTube, it's Over My Shoulder. It is now due out mid-September. So thank you to anyone who has pre-ordered. Links are in the description. There should be a QR code down below as well. But otherwise, let's get on with the show, because joining me as a returning guest to look at a lot of the news stories from this month and previous and get his unique take on things. He is a retired F-16 pilot and host of the popular YouTube channel, The Lehto Files. Returning to the podcast, Chris Lehto. How are you, Chris?
Yeah, great, Andy. Thanks for having me. Good to see you again.
Good to have you back on. I think this is your fourth appearance, if I'm right. I think you had a 2021, two in 2023. Wow. I was just checking before, and that's you back on after a 2.5 years away from the podcast. But you've been busy yourself, Chris, and there's a lot to talk about. You've got a unique perspective, I think, given your background as a pilot, and a lot of the work you do on your YouTube channel, even I feel as I watch it, has changed over the years and in various different ways. But before we get to all of that, I want to know, how do you follow the UFO topic right now, given your own unique perspectives and experiences, and what's your take on where things are at?
Yeah, I think maybe like a lot of people, disenfranchised with the disclosure movement or frustrated with it. I was very excited a couple of years ago, especially when David Grush first came out, although I was very angry with his statements, that saying that basically there was this hidden long-term crash retrieval program, kind of what a lot of people suspected. And then I assumed wrongly, I guess, that we would see massive progress. And I guess while we have seen progress, as suspected, and as many commenters wrote on my channel, as well as I'm sure you saw, is that we're not going to see any real major progress. It seems like there's always some big breakthrough right around the corner, and then it happens, and then nothing changes. That's kind of the general flow. But yet again, we're seeing more breakthroughs. I've been really interested in Burlison, Representative Eric Burlison's statements. That basically he argues we're going to get disclosure. Essentially, that's what I've seen from a few of his tweets lately, his expos, is that now we're finally going to get the truth. And I think we've heard this before. But is it different? I don't know. So I guess I take a tempered view on the whole subject. Like you mentioned there, 2021, we've been communicating, and I've been a member of your Patreon, that you have of mine as well, I think, for the past 4+ years. And so we've kind of followed along this topic over that time. I'm going into my 5th year actually in this topic, and it's just a very difficult topic. I think what we hope for with disclosure would ultimately change the face of the earth. If you think about it, it really would be just a huge, massive change if we did find out the truth. And the truth is, as we suspect, I believe you suspect, that there is these underlying crash retrieval programs. There is non-human intelligence on the planet, and has been for many years. If that is true, and that were to come to light, then I really do think that the face of the earth would change, and you'd have a serious change in the order, the systems in place that are currently on the planet. And now I don't know if we're ready for that, to be honest. I don't think that sort of rapid change is necessarily what everyone wants. It may be what I would want. I wouldn't say things burning to the ground, but I do love seeing systems change rapidly. I'm kind of have an anarchist bone in my body. But I think in the general scheme of things, even if it takes a generation or 2 generations before we get some sort of disclosure or understanding, I'm fine with that. I've kind of come to peace, and I'm trying to find my own truth. And I've kind of changed lately where I'm kind of done ambulance chasing. For a while I was just following the day-to-day news of the UFO topic, and I was getting a lot of traction. People enjoyed, coming and checking into my channel and seeing what had happened lately, but I just found I couldn't do it mentally. It was just too tough to keep up with all the ups and downs and the promises of disclosure and then the letdowns. So now I'm kind of just interested in the true nature of reality and kind of going the next step, looking at the next level of the investigation, and trying to see through the cracks to not necessarily break open some sort of catastrophic disclosure, but to really, I guess, in my own mind, figure out what's going on.
Some interesting stuff there to pick through. You mentioned you were angered at Grush's statements. Is that around the fact that he's come out and said what we suspected with those crash retrieval programs?
Definitely. Yeah, it was just so, and it was so blatant how it's been done. Because originally my whole life, I just believed the mainstream narrative. You can't travel faster than the speed of light. Our science has basically reached kind of the pinnacle of understanding of physics and the natural world, which now I just think is utterly ridiculous. But I did believe that, and when Fravor first came out, it was like, oh, maybe it's possible, because he was a fighter pilot, really spoke to me in his testimony on the Tic Tac. Really, he seemed so credible to me, and I had met so many people like him and followed people like him as leaders and commanders. So I see no reason for him to lie. And I think his perspective on what happened is probably better than anyone else's. Anyone else that could have been there, David Fravor would be the ideal observer. He would know everything at that point, at least most things that your average top secret fighter pilot would know. And so that really changed my viewpoint. Like, could this be possible? So really, David Fravor kind of opened the door to me just mentally that could this even be possible? And then I started looking into it and interviewing people. And I'm sure you've interviewed probably hundreds of guests, and you just see the suffering they go through. They see something, to them it's real. Even they get multiple witnesses around them, and then they're just completely ostracized by society, and they're told they're wrong. They're told they're idiots. And it really inflames the part of me that cares about truth of reality, truth of the world. The Air Force beat into me like integrity first. That's the first core value of the Air Force, U.S. Air Force. It's integrity first, service before self, and excellence in all we do. But the first core value is integrity first. And that's really saying the truth, even though you don't want to, or it's not convenient. And so David Grush came out, and it just went against everything I'd been taught by the system that is allegedly perpetrating a lot of these, I would say crimes against humans, crimes against humanity. And so, yeah, I was really mad. I was really angry about it. And that kind of started me on this 6-month descent into, I don't know, some sort of Kundalini awakening or madness or something. I don't know. You said you got multiple questions on the state of my health. And yeah, it started with that event where I was just really mad. I remember driving and just yelling out the window, so mad for a few weeks. I was just so pissed, just yelling at the universe. But yeah, so now I've gotten through that point. I've kind of come to terms and understood, at least in my own mind, how it could be possible, why life on Earth is necessarily like that, and I think why and how this could be perpetrated for so many decades. And I kind of alluded to it before, but I look at it as a systems approach, and I think that the system has evolved over billions of years. It's not like we like to think that humans are the center of the Earth, and I just don't think that is actually the case. I don't think that's the true reality. I think we're just one perspective in a grand scheme of perspectives in the universe.
Yeah, and genuinely, like I said to you before we recorded, a lot of folks got in touch to ask how your health was, and like you say, you had a moment back around a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, and you took some time away. You've stepped away and clearly came through that, and obviously your channel's grown leaps and bounds in that time. You seem much happier in yourself as well, which is great. And when you took your time away, did you stay away from the topic altogether, or did you reevaluate and reassess maybe what you thought about the topic in the conversation?
I didn't take a break from the topic really physically. I kept at it. And in a lot of ways, I was making 2 videos a week. And for 6 weeks, I even went to 1 video every day. So I actually kind of went the other way, is I just doubled down. And it was very difficult, actually. And my subscriber numbers didn't grow really in that time. I think people could tell maybe that I was just grinding through it. You know, sometimes you're in a job and you're just doing it because you feel like you have to. I'm sure everybody can relate to that.
Yeah.
Because mentally, yeah, it was just not. It was very difficult, and it was also, you know, they put me in a mental institution actually, and so I spent 2 weeks in this in Lisbon mental house, and they were giving me very strong antipsychotic drugs, which are super hardcore. I wouldn't recommend to anybody. They don't even know how they work. Actually, I looked into it later. Doctors don't even know what they do, and they're very powerful. So it was a quite difficult experience. And now looking back, I don't know. I kind of enjoy difficult experiences. You know, at the time, suffering, you complain and it's so hard and pain, but now I'm fine. You know, so I look back, I'm like, well, what was the point of complaining the whole time? Or being so negative about it. I've kind of learned that, you know, everything comes around. You can be in just the lowest low of your life, and then a short time later, it's great, you know. And I'm basically got through that time. I changed some things, and yeah, feeling great. So it's just funny how life can just totally turn around, and I think those experiences is just part of the life experience, I guess. So I didn't take a break from the topic, but I was tired of it. And like I said, I don't follow the day-to-day news of UAPs. You know, it's like, if you can get, I'm sure you know, you can just get burned out from this topic. It's so difficult. And
God, yeah. I get folks ask me how I do it, and I can go days and days and days without checking my Twitter or the Discord or the UFO news, because I have other stuff I'm doing, and a life and a job and young children, and sometimes I think it's better to step away a couple of days. Even doing this podcast like yourself, I do 2 or 3 shows a week, but it's nice sometimes to then go in on a day when I feel like it. And I think that can be important. Do you know what? I feel 1 o'clock in an afternoon, got a couple of hours. What will I do? Cool. Let me jump onto X. I'll go to certain accounts, people like UAP James, wow. And I'm going to forget loads, of course, but people who are really good at keeping up with the news, and I'll check what they're reposting. Then I'll go and look into it myself and just kind of follow up things from there. And I think that can be a healthier way to do it, because like you say, and there are people who do the day-to-day stuff, like Pavel at Psychoactivo, all that kind of stuff is great. Very different way, I think, of approaching the topic, and there's a lot of folks who love that. I enjoy jumping into Pavel's content as well. But for me, it lets me look and go, that was a big story sometimes on the day, but then 2 or 3 days later, it's gazumped by something else, or it no longer seems important. So for me, I don't have the time or the energy to do a daily check-in and daily chasing up of the news, but that retrospective look a few days later or a week later can be helpful sometimes, and it gives you a little bit more focus, a bit more clarity. You get to see some reaction, the dust settles, and I think you get a broader picture of what's going on. And I suppose that leads me to mention, you mentioned Representative Eric Burlison. I've had Representative Burlison on this podcast before, and it's funny seeing him become the new political face of the UFO topic recently, I think, for many. Tim Burchett, I think, was that guy for a while. I know Tim is still involved, but I don't know if Tim's taken a proactive step back or whatever it's been. Eric Burlison's kind of leapt to the forefront, because I can't see Tim Burchett as attending, you know, the Nazca Mummies conventions and whatnot, whereas Eric Burlison is. Eric Burlison isn't into this topic for the last 20, 30, 40 years. He is literally learning as he goes. And I think I just saw George Knapp on Weaponized when I was checking that one out today. And he's saying how there's some folks aren't happy that an Eric Burlison is being spoken to by a Stephen Greer. But Eric Burlison has to work his own way through this topic, and he's got David Grush on his staff. He's got a lot of great connections, I'm sure, but it's hard for Eric Burlison to work out, and he has to find his own way, who to listen to, who not to listen to, what in this topic is worth following, what isn't. And I think a lot of folks project their frustrations onto that. Why is Eric Burlison saying this? Why is he not following this up? Why is he doing this? He's looking at this whole open book of the UFO topic. He's a bird's eye view, I think, of it, and he's having to come down and go, what do I get involved in? What do I not get involved in? And again, from your point of view, do you think that's really difficult for a Representative Burlison to do that and please anyone in the topic at the same time?
Yeah, I think it's difficult to please anyone in this topic. I'm sure as soon as you post anything, you're a grifter. Even you're making no money, you're a grifter somehow. And Burlison, for political gain, I don't think the UAP UFO topic is necessarily a good avenue. Although Tim Burchett has certainly made a name for himself. He seems to have been popular. He has quite a successful YouTube channel. I don't know how many subscribers he has, but I think it's more than us. So I think he does do well with the topic. So maybe it has helped him politically. But I'd say overall, anytime you open yourself up, anytime you enter this topic really hard on either side, you're just going to get hammered by either side. Essentially, it doesn't matter. Like Jake Barber came out. I was very excited for Jake Barber to come out, and he was just completely hammered by some elements of the UFO community. Who knows who's the actual perpetrators or whatever. Lou Elizondo, I think he's furthered much of this discussion, and yet he's the enemy to many people who say that they want UFO disclosure. I find that really interesting. So I think, if you wade into this topic, it's not an easy battlefield. You're going to get shot from all sides. So I think it's amazing. I think it's fantastic that Burlison is talking about this. He always seemed very interested in it. You've watched him kind of progress through the UFO hearings, where it was, you could tell he was a skeptic, but he knew a lot of about science. That was my impression. He seems like a very smart guy. He seems like educated technologically. And so he was asking really pointed questions on how this could be possible, how this could be possible. And then I've just watched him over the years. Now he's coming to where he's putting out tweets saying, we're going to get the truth, And so I don't know. I guess I worry for him, but I really am really happy to see it, because I always thought from the beginning that he seemed like the guy you wanted pushing this. He seems very smart. He started from a skeptical angle, and he has access as a congressperson. So I think he's the ideal person actually to further the movement.
It's funny you mentioned 4 years ago, 5 years ago, we've been doing this kind of stuff now. People have been watching, listening, getting on board, and in that time, people will have left the topic, came back. Folks who have been involved in this, I hear, for decades, who never leave the topic, and everything in between. Lou Elizondo, I think maybe 4 years ago, was the tip of the spear. Everyone seemed I can't say everyone, but most people, I think, in the UFO community were quite together, and they were on board with the Lou Elizondo train and what was being said and done. And it seems now everything's very fractured, so there's a lot less of one direction to follow, and it's very splintered between people who have gone off the academic route, the scientific route. You've got folks who will religiously, almost cult-like, follow certain YouTubers or influencers, and you've got other folks who have jumped off of different bandwagons. So there just seems to be so many different camps now set up all over. I get how it can be hard for folks to follow. I've said personally, Chris, I don't think I fall into any one major camp at the moment in that respect. Perhaps maybe what the Sol Foundation are trying to do, albeit I don't think publicly there's much of we're waiting on them doing X. Well, Skywatcher, we hear they're going to land a craft and summon it in, and I'm going to get to that with you. but Sol seem to be doing their work perhaps more quietly in the background and working away. Is there any one organization that you look at perhaps and think that's one that may produce results?
I think the best is multifaceted approach. I think the reason I'm optimistic, or more optimistic for today than say 20 or 30 years ago, or 40 or 50 or 60, all the times in the past,
Yeah.
that we could actually see some movement on this, is now we have the internet, we have AI, and we have decentralized investigation. There's people like me who I have my own weird angle or perspective on it. You have your own perspective. You have organizations like Skywatcher. You have To the Stars Academy, which may or may come back. Jim Semivan said they are making a comeback. You have the Soul Foundation, UAP Disclosure Fund. So I think there is strength in numbers, and information is the weakest power. That's the best part of this whole thing is, hard power, having that's why we have weapon systems, like F-16s, et cetera, is it's very hard to beat an F-16 with information. You can, but it has bombs and guns. It's hard power. But information, that's why it's all kept so secret. That's why we go to such lengths to compartmentalize things in the military. That's why we all complained about compartmentalization in the military. All of us, anytime we're trying to do an actual mission, real world mission, security would come in the way. And the reason you do all that is because once that information is out, it's over. It's effectively useless. All the information you have to build that F-16, right? That's really that's critical. Or to build that stealth technology. If you know how to target and track a B-2 bomber, all of a sudden those billions and trillions of dollars spent to develop and create that B-2 bomber are useless. So the information is the weakest power, and that's why they have to keep it so secret. But the good news is it's the weakest power. So once that information is leaked, now it can have very wide-ranging effects. So we're basically in an information war, if you think about it. And so decentralization is the best way. It's, if you're talking, we're in an asymmetric war as well, where we argue, or I would argue, that the nation states or elements of the nation states have all the cards, right? They have overwhelming information. They have the systems. If they've been capturing them, crash retrieval, they have the money. They have the extreme will to do violence and all the terrible things that we've heard about over the years. But in an asymmetric war, the U.S. didn't win in Afghanistan. The U.S. didn't win in Iraq, and they had much less money, much less organization, information. But they were decentralized. How do you fight? How do you win a war against millions of ants? Or decentralized points. So I think that's the main advantage now, is that there are people like me investigating, and information is the war we're in. So I think the more of these organizations that are truly dedicated are looking at it from different angles, the better. So I guess I don't follow any one. I'm happy to see them all, actually, and I wish them all luck. I think Skywatcher has a very good chance if they can, call down consciously or psionically or using a dog whistle, whatever. If they can call down an object and actually capture it, I mean, that would be pretty hard evidence. I think that could turn the tide. If Soul Foundation can use all their scientific experience to actually prove that some sort of material came off world, I think that could be a turning point. To the Stars Academy, if they could bring in more dedicated military whistleblowers, or they use Tom DeLonge's star power and just get a ton of whistleblowers, that'd be great too. Even Stephen Greer, I mean, he's brought out tons of whistleblowers, and I've interviewed a lot of them, and they seem credible and legitimate. So I don't know. I think we're in an information war, and I think decentralization is our one strength, actually.
The information aspect of it's interesting because I think you mentioned earlier we now have the internet, we now have AI. How credible information is very subjective because people now don't believe scientists and academics and legal brains and medical minds on all kinds of topics that we really don't know much about. You pick and choose different sides, and I can't see the UFO information war being any different to that. We heard before the Trump administration came in, they were going to make big waves in terms of information coming out. And just in the last couple of weeks, J.D. Vance, Vice President of the US, for anyone who doesn't know, has said he's really into the topic and he's going to, get to studying it and get to the bottom of it. But we've heard this before, and this isn't just a Trump administration problem, but they've been more open about discussing this, including in Trump's first sitting as president, where he obviously had that interview with his son and they mentioned Roswell. So is this just sound bites for the news? Is this a way to distract from other things that people don't want out just now? Because surely J.D. Vance is someone who has sway and has power and has influence. He is right under the president. And if not him directly, surely he can tap Donald on the shoulder and have a word. I find that a bit of a crossroads in terms of, you can get this information out there, and they're almost choosing not to. In the same breath, Chris, I'll mention Donald Trump last month was on the Pod Force One podcast, which is hosted by Miranda Devine, and she asked him about the New Jersey drone situation, which I like the media is still pursuing this, because this is going back to last year. And as much as people say it started in the east coast of the US, it started in the UK the month before, or 2 months before, where US bases in the UK and were having incursions of these drones. It then moved over to the States, where obviously things picked up in a big way. And I'll just read you kind of paraphrasing what Trump said when he was asked about the drones. I can't tell you who it was and what it was. I'd love to tell you, actually, but it's not a big deal. It's not a problem at all. So from that statement, it's a bit jumbled, but Trump's giving you I know who it is. And we all know how Trump talks at this point, right? And I'm not stupid. No one's stupid listening to this. He's alluded to, I know what it was. I can't tell you what it was. I would love to tell you what it was, but it's not a problem. He did say one of his first actions before he came into the White House was going to be, I'm going to tell everyone. Was it day one he promised who and what this was? And then it hasn't happened. So either Trump is deliberately keeping this back, which may be the case, or if you want to go slightly more conspiratorial with the whole thing, there are powers above Trump who aren't allowing the president of the United States to come out and say who this was. And I wonder, where do you fall down on that?
Yeah, those are interesting comments, right? It was all just research drones. Isn't that what they said? They came out, it was just research drones, nothing to see here. Meanwhile, at the time, there was no research going on. They didn't say who's doing the research. How do you have, over 50 large drones flying in from the ocean? No one can claim them. It's really interesting comments. And I guess I have my own perspective. Is I take a systems approach to this whole thing. I think there is something bigger than Trump, and it is the nation, the state. It's basically not one man. The nation is not one man. And if you look, whenever they say we can't release this, we can't talk about that, what's the main argument? And the primary argument is it's for national security, right? National security. And national security does not mean any security of people, right? Maybe all the people together, but the people are expendable. Look at any war. I was basically paid to be expendable as an F-16 pilot. That was my job. So look at your national drafts. It didn't matter that you didn't support the war or World War II. They were pulling up your grandparents. Your grandfather probably was drafted to go fight in World War II. My grandfather was drafted. He didn't want to do that. So I think national security is really the main driver for why this is all being kept secret. Because as soon as they admit and I think it would have to be the president, right? Yeah, the vice president said something that's amazing. He said he wants to get down, look into it, figure it out. I think the only thing that would actually move the needle on disclosure in the US would be the president coming out and saying that, yes, this is true. We have a crash retrieval program. I think that's the only thing people would believe. And even then, they'd probably say it's a psyop.
Yeah.
Right? That's the big thing. Even if they come out and say, yes, it's true, what you thought the whole time is true, people will say it's a psyop without a doubt.
That's my point now, Chris, that I think no
Yeah.
matter who comes out, and it even goes back to the Biden administration, it was probably not as prevalent during Obama because that was longer ago than even I kind of care to remember. Social media has grown so differently since then. And we've had COVID, which I think was one of the big momentum changers of the kind of 20th century in modern human history, where people are divided with experts now, and experts on both sides are giving opposite information. So I don't think no matter who came out and said we have this, it would be questioned. You would get people believe it, people wouldn't. People would look for the reason behind the reason. And that to me is just it's a strange place to be in. I know the whole, I mentioned a couple of times, the whole Epstein thing doesn't seem to go away, even though I think some folks want it to go away, which seems very, very clear. The UFO conversation, people are saying, could be used to mask that, but do you really try and draw attention away from the Epstein conversation by going, look, aliens over here? I don't think it's as easy as that to do that. So it's a really strange one. And I want to ask you on whistleblowers. First off, I know you've interviewed Michael Herrera. I think that was around a year ago. I was just double checking on your channel. For those unfamiliar, Michael Herrera, whistleblower, former US Marine, very quickly in Indonesia, 2009, during a humanitarian mission after an earthquake. Michael claims he saw a large black octagonal UFO in the jungle. It was levitating. There was other personnel with him. He was just there for security reasons. He wasn't involved in what was happening. And he claims to have witnessed a human trafficking operation of sorts taking place, people being taken on board. Him and his colleagues were threatened at gunpoint to not talk about it. And he came out and spoke from, I think, 2023 onwards. Unfortunately, I was really hoping to get Michael on the podcast, and we had been talking the last couple of months. He's come out and done an interview with Ross Coulthart, a really good interview, and I would recommend people also check out Chris, your interview with him for a kind of a deeper dive into his story. He's now saying he's not going to do any more because he feels he's told his story. He wants to kind of stay in the background now for a while, which I understand. What's your take on the Michael Herrera story, but more largely, whistleblowers coming forward in the last year? Jake Barber, Matthew Brown, since David Grush, we've had Jason Sands, Sarah Gamble, Lenville Logan, perhaps to a lesser extent. What's your take on this whistleblower culture and where it's going?
Yeah, I wish they got better support, to be honest, when they came out. I think it's extremely courageous to put your name out there and your story, especially if you're like Michael Herrera, Matthew Wygant as well. He came out because you're going to be treated poorly, and yet they still came out. But I'm still surprised by the vitriol that they're met with when they do tell their story and come out.
Is that publicly? You mean from the public?
Yes, exactly. And it's also interesting you hear about these whistleblowers when they try and tell their story to Congress. It's very difficult to get in touch with the right people. Matthew Brown, for instance, he talked about he tried for months, maybe longer, to try and tell his story to any Congress people about Immaculate Constellation. And he was just kind of met with nothing, lack of replies. And then when he does go public, people like Mike Herrera are met with, they're liars, they're grifters, even though he's not gaining anything. I don't know what Mike is benefiting out of going public. And he did release a video on X basically saying that he doesn't recommend that whistleblowers come forward, And I don't think that's good either. I think we need whistleblowers to come forward. We have to. And if you look, they've tried to protect them with the laws, the U.S. UAP Disclosure Act, which was ultimately shut down, or most of it was shut down. But that they understand it. At least Congress people understand that protecting the whistleblowers is required, and yet they still can't do it. They still just can't make it happen. But I think it's paramount. We have to have the whistleblowers come out, and even if some of them are allegedly paid psyops, which again, what is the benefit? If Mike Herrera is some agent of the state, what is the point, of him being the psyop? And I love the depth of conspiracy theory that people will go to explain that it's like the government trying to keep us in the dark or distracted by coming up with this other alien invasion idea, or there'll be a false flag alien invasion, and that's how they'll like unify in a one world government. I've heard that as well. But who are you going to believe at the end of the day? So you're just not going to believe any whistleblowers? If the state is perpetrating this, then you have to have people like Jake Barber, like they would exist. And we need those people to actually come out and say that, yes, I was there when we collected these UAPs, when we collected an NHI. I know how we collected them. I know how we attracted them. Those people would exist if that is a reality, that we have a crash retrieval program. So I think we have to have the whistleblowers, but we also have to protect them. If you look at, I interviewed John Kiriakou. I don't know if you've heard of him, but he was a CIA whistleblower who whistleblew on the torture that the CIA was doing, particularly in Pakistan, waterboarding, etc. And it was found that he was correct. Right, they were torturing, and the U.S. literally wrote the Geneva Convention against torture, right? And here is the U.S. doing the torture, and he brought it up, and he said when he was in the CIA and said, "Hey guys, we can't be doing this; it's against Geneva Convention," and they put him in jail. They sent him to jail for 2 years on some trumped up BS charge. Well, time goes on, and it turns out he was correct. They were totally wrong going against the Geneva Convention, that the US did right. And yet I don't think he's looked at as a hero definitely not by the government. I don't think they consider him a hero. Look at Edward Snowden, right? He still is not allowed back in the US. And they found that his claims were correct in 2 federal courts. They found that, the NSA was collecting illegally against all Americans. They also found in a federal court that his releases of information to journalists, by the way, he didn't just put it on the internet. His releases of information can't be proven to have caused any harm. So, and yet he's still holed up in Russia. And I'm sure you'll get people that'll comment on this saying that, well, he ran to Russia. It's like, well, no, he didn't, right? He was going to Ecuador. Mm-hmm. And when he was going through Russia, the US pulled all of his passport clearances, so he couldn't travel. He couldn't get on an airplane. So they literally locked him in the Moscow airport. That was the U.S. If the U.S. was really concerned about him giving this information to Russia, then why did they lock him in the Russian airport? That just makes no sense. They would have at least let him go to Ecuador. So I think we have a long way to go on whistleblower protection. Just in general, I mentioned before, it's about the national security, and national security is not any individual person. I think, as we've seen, I believe in the past too, I think presidents are expendable as well. JFK was likely killed by some element of the national security state, and there are theories linking it to UFOs, Bay of Pigs, all that. But I think we can all agree that the CIA, or at least elements of the CIA, did have involvement in his assassination. That is the state. That's the national security, which is interesting because the CIA is directly below the president. They should be working for the president. But again, I think it's a whole system, right? A nation is a giant integrated system of billions maybe trillions of different parts, and humans we're just one element of that. And I think we're not as important as we think we are. So I think whistleblowers need to come out, but the system is not going to let them, and they're going to continue to disparage any sort of whistleblowers.
I feel for whistleblowers, and I've not mentioned this on the podcast before, but I've had guests who have come on the podcast, whistleblowers who wanted to come on, but they've asked to delay coming on because they've been looking for a job, because they've left a role in government, and they've found it difficult sometimes to get a job because they've appeared on a podcast talking about an experience or what they've been through. And whether that's through nefarious means, they're being blocked, or just because an employer's found them online on some UFO podcast, they've went, look, I'm better just not doing this for now. I totally understand that. And I've never had a whistleblower or guest come on this podcast and ask for money or an appearance fee. And I'll be honest, the only people who have ever asked for appearance fees were some of the folks from Ancient Aliens when they were doing a tour in the UK, and I politely declined because I didn't. And if a guest needed money for an appearance, I would understand, it's their time and everything. I've never had that before. And like you say, if any of these folks were psyoping and anything like that, you feel for them because they're going through a lot in their personal life as well, even just to gain employment afterwards as well. And a lot of folks don't tend to see that aspect of it. They just hear the story and then think they go off into their huge psyop mansion wherever they live, and they've got lovely buffet at the end of an evening, and they're treated well. And it's not necessarily the case for a lot of these folks. I don't know if you've heard recently, I had Ivan Hanel on the podcast. He is the legal representative of Lou Elizondo these days. He said, Chris, that he's got a new client who he hopes will be coming forward in the coming weeks. He says it's a businessman, a patriot, and this gentleman has been exposed to technologies he believes are not of human origin. You've obviously said there you don't think it's whistleblowers are protected. This guy doesn't seem to have a military background. Apparently, as a businessman who's been involved, I think, the private sector, and for somehow has come across some kind of technology and wants to come forward and talk about this, and apparently we're going to get it. Do you think it's different for folks who then maybe aren't from a military background to come forward? Is it easier? Is it more difficult? Or do you think it would be the same?
I think it should be the same. I guess I don't really know. I have a military background, but I think it's easy to forget that we're all just people, and you mentioned there, when you're looking at someone online and you see them come out like Mike Herrera, it's easy to like demonize them or call them grifters or call them a psyop. And it's very easy to forget that it's not a screen that you're looking at, right? There's a real person on the other side of that. Even your celebrities, right? I was watching Joe Rogan recently, and he said the idea of celebrity is just a myth. Like it doesn't actually exist. You build up in your head this idea of someone or something, right? That there's larger than life or different, but no, they're just a regular person. And the only thing that's different is your perspective on them.
Yep.
And I think it's easy online to just demonize. It's kind of the same mentality of road rage. It's easy when you're in a car and another car crosses you or something, you get angry. And it's not the person, or maybe it's the person driving, but it's really something else. Like when you're in a car and you're driving a car, you kind of become something else. It's like a different kind of entity.
Yeah, I'll give you that. Yeah.
So I think it's kind of a similar thing where looking online, it's easy just to be a troll. You think it's funny, or you're offended by this thought that comes out, and it because it offends your worldview, right? Because it challenges your ideas. And you mentioned different camps. Everyone has a different camp or different person they follow, and they think Stephen Greer is just this evil grifter, or they think he's the Messiah coming to save everyone. The real truth is he's just a dude, So I think it shouldn't matter civilian or military, being military doesn't make you better in any way or worse. You're just a person that was also in the military. And I think everyone in the civilian world has the same attributes, like
Yep.
I just have a different life experience. So I think it should be the same. And anyone can be courageous. Anyone can have integrity at the end of the day. And people in the military can also not have integrity and not be courageous. So I think either way,
I like that idea, and I resonate with that about celebrity, because I remember 2004, I went to New York to see WrestleMania 20 with one of my friends, and we were like 20 years old, 2004, 18, sorry, I was 18, 17, 18. And we were staying in a hotel quite near Madison Square Garden. And the day we arrived, it was like the college basketball playoff final, which in the UK, it's crazy to think a college basketball final would be sold out in a 20,000 seater arena. And it was impossible to get tickets. And but I don't follow the sport, let alone follow the college side of things. Okay. And I remember I got in like the elevator with my friend to go up to our room. And there was these huge big guys, like security detail. And they were standing in front of clearly a basketball player. But me and my mate just walked in, like scruffy dressed. And his dad had booked a really nice hotel for us. And we went into the lift or the elevator. And the security kind of moved as if like, don't get too near this guy. No idea who he was. Didn't care. Like I'm sure he was somebody famous. Could have been LeBron James at the time for all I know. Somebody can clear up exactly who the teams were. I wouldn't have known. But these guys were properly protecting him as if like, don't come near. And I couldn't have guessed the guy's name. But to other folks, he would have been like a god, like, oh my, I need an autograph, sign something. And it's just a person, just a guy. And it's funny how that happens in life. And I think in the UFO topic, people can get idolized and celebritized and everything else along with it. We're probably seeing a little bit of that just now with a kind of wave of the kind of tech bro podcasts that are. You've just interviewed Jesse Michaels. So you've got these guys have got really good backing. They have really nice setups. They can fly guests out to studios. They can spend a couple of days with a guest going around chatting and get a 3-hour interview. And it's a very different world. I don't want to speak for you, Chris, but at least for what I do, I am literally in a shed where outside my house, about 10 feet, my wife is probably now back home with my 3 kids from soft play. And I've spent the morning between doing my day job, preparing for this and another interview. So it's a very different way of podcasting. And that's why I think there's a difference between podcasts and big YouTube shows, which are essentially taken over from TV. But it's different ways of digesting this. And I think people like a Jesse Michaels are more like celebrities now than they were a couple of years ago in some people's eyes. So it's just how people are perceived. But anyway, I want to get on to a couple of listener questions.
Chris, 1 second though, I did have a point. It's funny you bring that up because I kind of thought that as well. But then when I talked with Jesse, and we had a long interview, 2 hours, and we chatted maybe an hour before on a previous day, and then even an hour after our interview. And actually, it's the same, man. He's in the same boat. Like he talked about wanting to quit. Just he wanted to do other videos besides just UAPs. He feels like he's invested. You could feel the stress of having to do it as a full-time job because he gave up his. He was doing venture capital diligence, so he gave that up and went all in to podcasting. So no, I think he feels all this pressure of having to put out content. And even the interview we did, if anyone goes to watch that interview, it's in his studio and you see it from the side, and it's just like it's just his extra room. It's nothing.
I know.
You look in his videos.
It could be a guy just sitting in his bedroom at home, like in his parents. I know it's not going to be his parents' house, but it could be a guy just sitting in a bedroom in his parents' house. Yeah. Yeah.
No, it's because it's funny. That's a perfect example because, no, he's just a regular dude with the same issues that you and I have. It's really interesting. Yeah.
Oh, I bet he pays his bills a lot easier than I do. But yeah, fair play to him. That puts in the work and the effort. One more thing I want to touch on. Have you ever interviewed Richard Bandurich?
No.
So he is the CEO of Fuel Propulsion Technologies. In a podcast he was on, it was actually back in December. the Ecosystemic podcast, and it was like a panel podcast. It was 2.5 hours long. Hal Puthoff was on it, Rich Bandurich, and a load of other scientists. Okay, and the episode was titled "Beyond Conventional Physics," and it kind of went a little bit under the radar. And to be fair to folks in my Discord channel, Chris, quite a few of them over the last few months have said to me, this podcast has a couple of episodes around UFOs, physics, science, advanced science that people are sleeping on, and it just doesn't get the traction in the UFO community perhaps it should. However, a couple of clips have surfaced of Rich Bandurich from that episode in December. Now, he has a background in electrical engineering, mathematics. He spent decades exploring novel propellant-free ways to push spacecraft, and reported to have held engineering roles at NASA, JPL, Lockheed Martin, and ULA, and contributed to DARPA projects. So the guy's got quite a serious background. And on the clips, he talks about studying materials of alleged non-human origin, says they can disintegrate when studied, almost as if they are intelligently controlled, and when in the wrong hands, fall to pieces. He says some of the material he's studied would cloak itself and try and blend into the environment. He said material would reconfigure itself, very Terminator 2 for me, you know, thinking of that kind of liquid metal type of thing. He said they could tell the material was extraterrestrial because it wasn't just decades ahead, but hundreds of years ahead of what we had. He also mentioned he had studied how large triangles could cloak and decloak, believing they were projecting what's behind them in front of them, and saying that they could actually study it and track them because the projection isn't and wouldn't be perfect, almost like there was a lag or delay potentially on it. And he doesn't believe whatever entities or groups have that particular technology would want us reverse engineering it, as it gives them an advantage over us. And I just thought that was a really interesting clip. Like I say, I don't know if you've seen it. It's going about online, folks. I'll share it in the description. People should go and check out that full episode, I'm sure. But again, you're starting to see people like this coming out, having these conversations. They're still not piercing the public veil and imagination. Because I think if you put that on 60 Minutes in the United States, or in the UK on BBC or ITV News, 9 o'clock at night, 6 o'clock at night, it could be a big story. Yet this doesn't hit the mainstream the way people like ourselves would like it to, Chris. And I wonder what's it going to take for conversations and comments like this, people like Rich Bandurich, David Grush, and others, to make a breakthrough that stays with the mainstream and really pushes the needle forward?
Well, I think the mainstream is changing. You know, we always talk about look at mainstream media. It's not television anymore. You know, Stephen Colbert, his show was canceled. He was the #1 show at that time slot, and you can say, you can argue it's political, it was done for political reasons, but ultimately it does come down to money, and they're not able to compete. You know, like you mentioned, you're in a shed, I'm in my basement, Jesse's in his spare bedroom. We're able to draw, you know, a lot of people. Look at Joe Rogan. You know, it's him and maybe 2 other people running his whole podcast, and he's #1 in the world, and he gets numbers that are dwarfing a lot of these so-called mainstream outlets. You know, the benefit that the mainstream has is it's on everywhere, you know, but not like people my age. You know, like I'm never watching TV. I never see like TV advertising. But when I was in the Air Force, every day, like every squadron you go into will have a TV on, and it'll be like CNN will be on, or Fox News, right? There'll always be some TV on. And I know people maybe a few friends in their 50s and definitely 60s, like my friends' parents, etc. They just have the TV on all the time, you know? And I think we underestimate the effectiveness of propaganda and advertising. You know, everyone knows about McDonald's and Burger King. Like, you definitely know they exist. And if you had to go and eat there, you would, right? But all these companies still spend billions of dollars on advertising. You know, that you definitely have heard of Adidas, right? But they still spend billions and billions of dollars advertising so that you can see that, right? So that there's a reason they do that. You know, there is a definite reason, and it works. So I guess the benefit of mainstream is that it just is always pumping into the minds of those people wherever you go. But that is changing. Like I mentioned, I think while optimistic is the decentralization of information. Whereas before you could have a few parties, a few centralized parties could control the flow of information, where they could just not run that story. They still have a lot of power, but it's decreasing by the day. The more people like me, the more people like you, the more shows that come online, the more numbers get drawn away from this alleged mainstream. I think we're just going to see more and more decentralized discussions, and it just takes time. I think there's a reason they continue these advertising campaigns for years. The more you see something, the more you start to actually believe it or accept it.
So maybe there's no mainstream, and that it's more of a plural. There's mainstreams that it's almost impossible to break into the mainstream because there are so many different. Because you could probably put a Joe Rogan podcast as the mainstream. Because I was really surprised the other day here in the UK. We've got several news channels that run 24 hours a day. Sky News, BBC News, and GB News is the new one. People will have their different thoughts and affiliations, the same as the United States, with different channels and political leaning and whatnot, and what they show you, what they don't show you. GB News is just overtaken the other two as our most viewed platform for news. Wow. I was surprised to hear it gets 90,000 viewers a day. And that's our number one. So with the millions of folks in the UK, I would have thought it would have been in the millions. But no, on our satellite TV networks, 90,000 people can now get you the number one news programme in the UK, above Sky and BBC, established organisations. And maybe, again, that's a shift in public perception, a shift in what the public are looking for, a shift in how the public view and consume its news. And it's funny, when I go and put fuel in the car in the morning, there's less and less folks going and buying newspapers. And I remember as a kid, you mentioned my granddad, he was a child during World War II. He only passed away a couple of years ago when he was in his 90s. But I used to go in a morning with my granddad to a local news shop and buy a newspaper, and there would be a queue of people buying the newspapers. That generation is gone, and those generations are dying out now because you're now buying yesterday's news.
Yeah.
Whereas you and me and people listening and watching this, most of us saw that news minutes after it happened. There were camera crews, there were people filming and live streaming. There's a revolution kicks off. There are people live streaming from multiple different angles at the same time. You can watch rocket attacks in Moscow and Ukraine and all these different countries around the world. Moments as they happen, you can literally watch, an attack's. We've seen some of the Israel Iron Dome stuff on the news, and you literally hear it's happened, and you're watching for the rockets coming in. So there's no longer a delay in news anymore. People can get it instantly. And I think that can also be part of the reason people move on so quickly from a news story, because there's so much news being consumed all the time. So perhaps the mainstream isn't even a thing anymore, and it's multiple avenues of mainstreams.
Yeah, no, I agree. I don't get my information from mainstreams. I go to YouTube. I have YouTubers that I trust, and they're accessing X. They go direct to the source. I think a lot of these journalistic outlets will probably be a thing of the past, and I think you're just going to see mainstream dying. The mainstream we consider mainstream. So then it'll be public opinion, and I think people have been conditioned over their whole lives. Like I said, up until just 5 years ago, I trusted the mainstream narrative, even though it hasn't delivered any real noticeable benefits. We still don't understand. Our physics can't even identify what inertia is, right? We argue and we listen to these alleged physicists on YouTube and TV, etc. The Brian Greens, the Sean Carrolls, Neil deGrasse Tyson, these physicists, right? But at the end of the day, they have no idea what inertia is, like why anything has any weight at all. And I think if your physics doesn't know what inertia is, then your physics is definitely incomplete, like from the beginning. Like there's no way around it. And then they proclaim to know the age of the universe, We don't even know when civilization started on Earth. Essentially, when they found Göbekli Tepe, that pushed the date back like thousands and thousands of years. I think it was 6,000 BC. They were saying was like Mesopotamia, and then lo and behold, they find Göbekli Tepe, and it's 10,000 BC. So you're talking 4,000 years before they originally thought modern civilization, if you will, actually started on Earth, and they're not even close on that date, and yet they proclaim to know how the universe started, how old the universe is, and it's just ridiculous, right? We say that the Earth is in the solar system is 4.5 billion years old, and yet the entire age of the universe is only 13.8 billion years. Our little tiny solar system speck of nothing in this giant universe, they argue is 1/3 the age of the entire universe. It's just preposterous, But that statement I'm saying right now, 99.9% of your viewers think I'm being ridiculous, right? Saying that the universe is way older than 13.8 billion years. That 13.8 billion years is just a ridiculous, preposterous number on the low end. 99.9% of your viewers think that's insane, right? But I think it'll just take time for that to change, for us to understand that, our mainstream science has been totally jacked. Our understanding of reality is completely wrong. And by the way, we have been kept in the dark about UFOs for many decades, so I think it'll just take time.
I think you've got more support than 0.1% on that challenge.
I hope so.
I think the way I look at it from a broad picture point of view is, and I'm certainly not a science denier, for the love of God, before anyone starts picking that up, right? But through the centuries, so many times in human history, we have believed that X was true. We make a scientific discovery, a scientific breakthrough, and Y becomes true. And that has happened so many times. We were sure we were this. We were sure this was true. We were sure we were the center of the universe. We were sure the sun revolved around us. Everything like that has at one point been, no, this is correct, and you're crazy to assume otherwise, and yet things have moved on. Yeah. And I suppose I'll finish on this one before listener questions. I don't know if you've heard Neil deGrasse Tyson's recent Star Talk episode. He's got John Kozlowski, the director of Arrow, on.
No, I didn't.
Go and at least check out some of the clips online. John Kozlowski is trying to talk about sightings of black triangles. He talks about city-sized objects. He talks about a police officer chasing an orb, seeing a triangle. And during the story, Neil deGrasse Tyson is pissing himself laughing at multiple points during the story where Kozlowski has to stop. And Kozlowski's, and I've not heard the full episode, folks, so I apologise. He's trying to be polite and cordial and professional, and it's Neil deGrasse Tyson's show. But deGrasse Tyson is deriding the whole thing. So this officer just never got his camera on. He didn't do this. Oh my God! So yeah, carry on, and just breaking it down constantly. And Kozlowski's, like I say, he's trying to be nice about it and give reasons why. And there's a mainstream scientist who I think many folks would argue hasn't been a real scientist perhaps for a long time in terms of what he does. He's more of a celebrity these days. He's kind of moved into that world, and he's maybe done his hard work, he would argue, over the years, and he's reaping the benefits now as the face of astrophysics. Or he was named, I believe, one of, if not the sexiest astrophysicist alive, which is, I'm sure he's very proud of that. But yeah, it was disappointing to hear. And I've said before I started this podcast, Chris, in 2017, 2018, around those couple of years before, I was quite a big fan of Star Talk and Neil deGrasse Tyson.
The same.
Then as the UFO topic kind of kicked off and got bigger, as after 2017, I didn't enjoy when it was discussed how degrading they were towards the topic. And I'm all for being able to enjoy the conversation. I appreciate folks that aren't UFO centric having a skeptical look at it, raising an eyebrow, even joking about the subject. I think you've got to do that, but you have to do that and then bring the conversation back to a place where they can maybe understand and progress and learn a little bit. Someone like Neil deGrasse Tyson, for me, just doesn't seem to want to. He's got his opinion and he's sticking to it. And again, as a layman, surely that goes against the very principles of being a scientist And surely he would want to go, right, this sounds ridiculous. However, let's go and take a proper look at this. Let's go look at the evidence. Let's go look at the data. And maybe we can find out something incredible that we can look back at 2024 and 2025 and 2017 and go, remember, we didn't believe there was alien life out there. And in 2025 and 26, actually, we do know there's life out there and things can progress forward. And that would be another step forward in kind of human understanding. That's what I'm at.
Yeah, it is funny because you bring up historical precedents, and which is so accurate. And they all say they know history, right? I'm sure Neil deGrasse Tyson has given many examples of historical events or happenings that supported his views. But what's funny is they don't follow any of the of the history, right? Nothing is surprising about the reaction from Neil deGrasse Tyson. If you look back in history, right, it's always been the case. Like the people in power and who had the pulpit, they always mocked and stigmatized the newcomers. You know, it was always Einstein. They all revere Einstein, right? Like I'm sure people like Neil deGrasse Tyson, most scientists, I would say, revere Einstein as this genius, but he was precisely the outsider that came in. You know, and I'm sure was initially mocked if it wasn't for Eddington, you know, in 2019, effectively proving his equations. So it's just funny, and what drives me insane is the hypocrisy. Just like you brought up, you know, science is about finding the truth no matter what and analyzing all options, and we're always incorrect. So when you're just shutting down a whole line of arguments, and we're still not getting the solutions, that's what makes me angry, is that we've had no breakthroughs, right? Like I made a recent video about 5 technological breakthroughs, and how they've been ignored. But if you look at fusion, you know, ITER, where you have these giant tokamaks for 70 years, right? Fusion's always been 20 years away. If you look at cosmology, right? They talk about, I'm sure you've heard the recent crisis in cosmology, but if you just go back 2 decades, right? It's the exact same crisis in cosmology then as is now. So there's no progress. If you look at quantum mechanics, right? They say that quantum mechanics is the most accurate. It's the most accurate theory ever. You look at quantum computers. You know, I argue we're never going to have a breakthrough with quantum computers, just like your fusion. And what I believe is because your underlying assumptions are incorrect, right? What do they say? Like insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result.
Yep.
And that's basically what they're doing. They're doing the same thing over and over again and expecting to get a different result. But you're not going to get a different result. You're going to get the same result over and over again. And that's what science has proven us. If something's replicatable, then it's accurate. It's science. But if you do the same thing over and over again, you're getting the same answer. You're missing out on this whole other solution set of science. And so it's really that hypocrisy that just drives me insane.
Do you know physicist Brian Cox, Professor Brian Cox from the UK? Famously, he was the keyboardist for the band D-Ream for the song Things Can Only Get Better in the 90s, folks, if you haven't heard it. But Brian Cox, incredibly intelligent individual. And again, I really enjoy watching him speak on the universe and science and planets, galaxies. He's really great to listen to. He can be really degrading similarly around the UFO topic. And what I find fascinating is he always cites his hero as being Galileo. Galileo, who famously was placed under house arrest by his peers for daring to question that the Earth wasn't the center of the universe. The heliocentric model, I think it was. I won't pretend to understand all the ways around that. But that's it. So then you've got a Brian Cox coming out and daring to laughing at everyone talking about, well, perhaps there's this something else. And his scientific mind just wants to put us under house arrest and not talk about it, much like his hero was all those centuries ago. So, yeah, science, please move on. And I think you've got to applaud people like Gary Nolan, Avi Loeb, Beatrice Villarreal, and all those other scientists who are daring to work on this topic, much to the chagrin of their colleagues and peers, who many of which don't. But I think more and more folks are starting to come on board with that, Chris. Yeah,
look at how many more people have listened to Beatrice, Villarreal in the last 2 years. You know, if you imagine her views, the people that she's reached compared to any one of her colleagues. You know, if you look at their actual peer papers, and you can say peer review is the end all be all, but how many people actually read those papers anymore? You know, you maybe a few thousand, and she's getting hundreds of thousands of views if you combine all of her podcast visits. You know, so that's where I think it is changing. It is going away from these mainstream educators. I think they call them science educators. And Brian Cox is a perfect example, right? Because he's been a huge proponent of string theory. And if you look, string theory is totally bunk theory, right? They can't even come up with a single test to prove their theory. And in my view, like, in no way can you say that's science. Like, it's not science. Like, it's not a theory. They should remove the word theory from string theory, because a theory, I think a scientific theory requires to be falsifiable. Like, there has to be a way to falsify it. And they can't even come up with a test to even test if it's falsifiable or true. So it's totally bunk. Like, it's useless. Like, he's just wasted all of our time. Like, when you say I've enjoyed listening to Brian Cox, that's the problem, right? Is they're very good speakers. Like, they're very good at talking. And like Neil deGrasse Tyson, he'll talk about, oh, the black hole, you know, you'll be spaghettiized, you know, and they'll make up these crazy visions. But dude, we're going to find out black holes are bullshit. Like, look at that image they had of the black hole, right? And they gave all these Nobel Prizes, and it made worldwide news, and they gave each other so many high fives, right? Imagine you presented that image to the UFO community, and we're like, look, we've proven UFOs, and you gave them that image, and tell them it was made from 70 different actual workshops around the world and fabricated into this one image. Like, you would be laughed out the door. Yeah, in many ways, and I find that too whenever I approach the UFO community and I make these videos about the ridiculousness of our current science world. They seem to have the same skepticism. They don't apply the same eye, right? They have a very critiquing eye to the UFO community, right? Oh, this guy's a psyop or whatever. But then if you aim it towards mainstream science claims, they're like, oh no, that's legitimate. And same thing that the scientists make, like Neil deGrasse Tyson, Brian Cox, you know, Sean Carroll, Brian Greene. If all these guys, if they took the same critical eye that they do, mocking eye that they do to the UFO community, if they aimed it to their actual own work, to the community, to the work that they're looking at, they would get vastly different results, right? So it's just, yeah, it's a completely Hippocratic perspective.
We'll dive into listener questions, Chris. And interestingly, the very first one was from Dan Lewis, and he wanted your thoughts on Beatrice Villarreal's recent announcements regarding the Vasco project and its discoveries regarding vanishing stars from photographic plates pre-Sputnik. Do you feel projects like these will lessen the stigma within the scientific community? Always enjoy watching Chris's channel. Can't wait to see the interview. And I'll just add, Chris, I was very fortunate to go a couple of months ago to see Beatrice Villarreal in person. She was presenting at a university, at the University of Durham here in the UK, not far from me, about half-hour drive. And she presented the pictures, you know, the initial papers that had been presented. So I got a kind of sneak preview of this. And really, basically, folks, I've mentioned this, I think, on a recent podcast, but Beatrice is essentially, and Chris, you can correct me, she is showing you a picture of stars that are taken, and then a second picture with the same stars, but some are missing. The stars shouldn't move, and they're trying to present, look, they're not saying these are aliens, they're not saying these are UFOs, but from a scientific perspective, Beatrice is presenting objects were here, then in this next picture, objects are not here. The picture taken months apart, you know, stars don't move in the sky, and she's saying we should be looking to investigate this as scientists. What were these objects? Why have they moved? And what can we do about that? That should be enough to spark and ignite a conversation, surely, in the scientific community.
You would think, but she's been presenting
based on what
that.
You said, yeah,
she's been presenting that for 2 years now, I think. You know, I originally saw that a couple years ago. I started chatting with her, and then I just haven't had her on the show, right? I tried to get her on recently, but it was like she was going to come on, and then I was busy. And then when I asked her to come on, she was busy. So I've been a big supporter of her work. I know she's been ostracized inside the scientific community because of her work and also who she worked with, right? There was a big scandal around one of the very prominent researchers that she worked with, but then there was a sexual assault claim against him, and so she was initially ostracized for that reason. And then she supported him because he hadn't been found guilty or anything in a court. So she thought it was wrong that people are ostracized without being found, without going through due order. So I know it's been a long time coming. So I'm very happy to see that she's getting a lot of traction. Like I mentioned, she can be ostracized from conferences, but again, who is even looking at those conferences? You know, these mainstream science places, right, where it's the halls of power, academia, who holds all the knowledge. Again, what have they actually delivered, right? And I would say jack squat. Like, they have not delivered anything because they're too close-minded. Or they've been manipulated, which, I think there's a good argument for that they've been manipulated to not make progress. Again, I think based on national security, if there is an easy way to do lattice confined fusion that doesn't require giant tokamak reactors, if ultimately, if we just have a misunderstanding of how stars create their energy, right? If it's not based on the current standard model of the sun, which I think is probably incorrect, then there is a chance that any, smart high schooler could create cold fusion in their basement. For instance, let's say that is the case, that we just misunderstand fusion and it's actually much simpler than we think based on our misunderstanding of how the world actually works. Now you potentially give amazing, unbelievable power to all of our enemies, right? Anyone in North Korea can now have cold fusion. You could have rogue elements, any terrorist organization. If they could create cold fusion, lattice confined fusion, that amount of power in a basement could be an immense weapon. So I think it's not necessarily their fault that they're so close-minded. I think historically, as we've been talking about, mainstream science has always been closed-minded. Like, they're always going to criminalize the Galileos. There's countless examples I put in my last video of many examples. Birkeland, he found auroras. Recent examples, Halton Arp, he's found a lot of anomalies with quasars. And now most recently you have Beatrice Villarreal. She's found these anomalies with the stars. And I think that's the best way to look at it and to coach it and to market it as anomalies, right? And I think that's one of the main problems that we found with these science educators. I think Neil deGrasse Tyson, his book, the first sentence or the last sentence, I'm not sure, but basically his argument is the universe is under no requirement to be understandable to you. I paraphrase it. But basically, Neil deGrasse Tyson's argument is, you're not going to understand the universe, and it's too complicated. And this is kind of the scientific argument in general: is it's quantum mechanics is too complicated for you to understand.
Yep.
Cosmology, astrophysics is too complicated. Let me tell it to you. Let me explain it to you because I'm so smart, I'm so educated, and I have so much experience. But remember back to what we said at the beginning. He's just a dude. You can think however you want. Again, he's just sitting in his living room, and he hasn't done any real science in decades. And I argue these dudes aren't doing any science now. If you're mocking some idea, an alternate physics model, or if you're saying all these thousands of people who see these UFOs are insane and you're just mocking them, that's the opposite of scientific thinking. Scientific thinking should be objective, and you should be open to all solutions, especially if you have produced jack and squat for us. There's no quantum computers. We haven't produced jack or squat. There's no fusion. You have not created fusion. You have not created anything related to entanglement. You've created no actual quantum communication. You haven't discovered expanding space, right? All of their predictions related to the universe are completely wrong. right? Everything that's not a theory, right? If your theory is completely wrong every time, you're not predicting anything, right? When JWST seeing galaxies fully formed past the previous distance limit and your predictions are wrong, like that should be a slap in the face, you know? So yeah, I'm not impressed by any of these dudes. I don't think they're real scientists.
Paul had a question, and first off, he said, I love Chris's show. He's highly observant, and I like how he follows his own beliefs and doesn't mind calling others bullshit. And Paul was also one of those, Chris, who was asking how you were, which you covered earlier. So cheers for that, Paul. But Paul also wanted your thoughts on Skywatcher. It's an organization that for many, they've put a lot of faith into in producing results. Much of that, I think, Chris, it's fair to say, is down to what they promised early on, especially Jake Barber, big claims of being able to attract craft and land them. That seems to have been somewhat walked back in the initial months of Skywatcher, that actually we're going to try and do this and we're going to try and demonstrate it. The claims seem to be they could do it. And what's your take been on the Skywatcher approach, their progress, and the likelihood of them producing results?
Yeah, thanks, Paul, for the question and support. And also thanks to Dan. I met Dan. It's great. Yeah, I'm really still optimistic for Skywatcher. I think their first video that came out that really showed some great UAP imagery. You know, they came out with the 9 types of craft, etc. But they did have big claims, right? That they were able to call in these craft and then have them land and capture them. They also claim that they have a dog whistle, some sort of technological device that can call in these craft. I mean, I wish them the best. I don't know. Obviously, results will, you know, prove themselves. And if they cannot deliver, then does that invalidate the whole approach? You know, I don't think it does. I think just because you can't replicate a system, Jake Barber argues, you know, the system has been in place for many years, the retrieval capture program. It's certainly not good if they can't replicate it, right? I mean, that would be immediate proof of the technique and the crash retrieval program in general. But it's also, if they can't replicate it, it doesn't invalidate it. So yeah, I would love to see them actually have progress. I know Ross Coulthart was on an event with them, and he told me in person he saw firsthand this blue orb after they did this basically call in kind of technique. So I don't know, maybe it can only be done on small scales. You mentioned before, like that guy claimed from the civilian sector that the technology can disintegrate itself. You know, if we really are dealing with technology that's, they say hundreds of years, but why couldn't it be millions of years ahead of us?
Yep.
You know, is it possible that it can actually delude detection by just disintegrating? I don't know, you know, but it doesn't prove that the technique is not correct.
I'd love your take on their kind of 2-pronged approach. Now, I've just had James Hodgkins on the podcast, who great guest, wonderful feedback, and if you've got a chance to speak to him, Chris, I think he'd be great for your show as well. He is one of the psionic assets, as they're labelled by Skywatcher. He has a wonderful set of abilities he's talked about, essentially can connect to this phenomenon psychically, psionically, and call these objects in. So you've got that aspect of it. You then have the dog whistle, which is in my head, it's always a big rectangular box. I don't know what it looks like, but they have a switch they can flick, and it apparently works every time. Psionic, not every time. The actual technology they've got, whatever the frequency is they're sending out, however it works, it could be a bat signal for all we know. It calls them in every time. What's your take on then that 2-pronged approach? And again, for me, it does seem the claim initially was we are doing this already. What's to stop them showing these results publicly? And is there maybe something more to that in the background? A lot of folks, Chris, are alluding to the fact that perhaps they've got a public-facing agenda and perhaps they have a private agenda, which may not be a negative thing, but they're trying to give the gatekeepers, the folks in the background, the big technology companies the opportunity, who maybe have a hand in keeping this secret covered up, the opportunity to work with them and find a way forward?
I mean, I could certainly see that. Like I mentioned, I've kind of changed my viewpoint, where maybe this catastrophic disclosure is not necessarily the best thing. When I interviewed Jim Semivan, and he relayed, I think Hal Puthoff had attended this conference done inside the government. And at the beginning of the 3-day conference devoted to disclosure, everyone said, yes, we should have disclosure immediately. And then they basically gamified it. You know, they looked into what would actually happen, what are the benefits, what are the negatives. And every one of them at the end of the conference said, no, we shouldn't have disclosure. And I think for what I kind of relayed before is national security, right? You would have serious consequences, not for you and me as a human. I think it would be, I would argue, better for us, at least knowing that we're not alone, knowing, you know, possibly, you know, are we talking about life after death? Is this related to the afterlife? You know, do we find that we really all are eternal beings, or we're all connected through some ether type of consciousness back to the source? You know, you hear of this and all the online new age movement, you know, which I think we have amazing evidence for with near-death experiences. I think NDEs are really one of our best experiences or evidence for some sort of afterlife. And if you look at near-death experiences, it seems to correlate. There's many correlations, similarities between near-death experiences and UAP, UFO experiences or abduction cases. I just interviewed James Landoli on the show, and he basically it wasn't a near-death, but he was in a car accident, and he ended up above the accident. You know, like you hear the classic, just a point in space above looking down on the situation. And then the next day he has a UFO experience, telepathic communication, goes outside and sees these craft. So I think it would be amazing for us at our level, at the human level, to find out about that and understand that we're not alone, and we're not alone in the universe, and we can feel better inside or fuzzy or whatever. But I think it'd be extremely detrimental, or possibly detrimental at least, for the nation states above us, right? All these systems who have put everything on the line to keep us away from that truth. If that is the truth, it seems that way, or it seems we're going that direction. So I think it could be possible that people in the know, the reason why they haven't come out and told us explicitly, and why they've done so many terrible deeds to keep it secret, is there would be obvious negative consequences to the national security state. And so I could see that, yeah, you could have entities like this that they want to prove it. They even start out on that path, but once they're shown that the truth, or once they come to grips with actually flipping the switch between disclosure and not disclosure, you know, maybe there's a reason they don't flip it.
Yeah, I've talked about that idea before, of this whole connection to the afterlife, and I think one of the really grim but obvious ones would be folks who are in manic states of depression, or end of life care, or going through some horrible disease or illness, or just a really bad time in their life, find out, you know, it's basically Super Mario and you've got infinite lives. Then you deal with that accordingly. And do you end up with mass suicides the world over for weeks and weeks and weeks on end? And how does that affect everyone on the planet? A little bit like, did you ever watch the series The Leftovers?
No.
So the whole premise of The Leftovers, I'll get the number wrong here, is that it's something like 6% of the world's population disappears in an instant. A little bit like a Thanos snap. Some planes fall out the sky, babies disappear from prams, but it seems so random as to who goes. And the whole story picks up and it's filmed totally serious, very real. How does humanity deal with this going forward? There's no answers. There's people have hypotheses. Was it a rapture? Was it something scientific? You know, whatever it may be. And it's almost that idea of, how would humanity deal with this new realization just happening all in an instant? You get cults, you get suicide cults. There's a weird cult in it where they just smoke and they don't speak to each other anymore. They decided not to speak. But I'd recommend it to folks. It's really, really good. It's only a couple of seasons long. Really interesting series with a really interesting idea at the heart of it as well. But yeah, I just wonder, is it something like that where actually the idea of we have a non-human intelligence we are aware of isn't actually at all the big deal? That's just that, okay, but here are some other things that come along with it. And that's the stuff where folks are keeping this secret because you might think they're the bad guys, but ultimately it's not the technology. It's something in the background where this whole experience for some might become more the whole human experience, whatever it is, but for others it suddenly becomes less valued. Where actually, I'm not having the best time of it. I'm going to move on to what's next because you then have that certainty.
Yeah, I'm sure everyone's had that experience, right? What is it? Don't meet your heroes. Where we talked about that, where you build up this idea in your brain of some perspective, and then you learn the underlying truth is nothing like you thought. Right? You meet your alleged hero and you hate them or dislike them or something, you know, and so it crashes all your original views or perspectives. And so, yeah, I think that could definitely be part of it. I think the list of negatives or potential negatives is very high, and the list of positives to the systems, the nation states, the security states that have been propagating, you know, this I would call it a myth. You know, the threats to them are great, and the benefits are very small. So that's why I think it's probably not going to come from the security state. You know, the disclosure. It'll have to come from pressure from us, like people like us at our level.
And do you think it makes the most sense then that any information that does come out would have to be drip fed over decades where, and I've often surmised that perhaps the easiest way, even for the governments of the world to bring this forward is to use like the James Webb and acknowledge technosignatures of something very far away that we have to send a probe to. It's going to take hundreds of years, but that opens up the conversation here at least. Okay, are there things visiting here? Have things happened before? Then you can find something closer to home. Perhaps, you know, the conversation escalates then, but you have to maybe almost play dumb and go, oh, we've found something really far away, and gradually bring it closer to home. And you have that disclosure over 5, 10, 15 years.
Well, most likely the information's already been released. It just hasn't been accepted. You know, we've had many whistleblowers, and they have what we would call ridiculous claims. You know, but what if one or many of those whistleblowers' claims are correct? Then, you know, the information has already been disclosed. It just hasn't been absorbed, you know, or accepted by the mainstream.
They would have to have it confirmed, though, wouldn't you? And who would you listen to? Would it have to be a president of the US coming forward and saying, here's the information, and giving you essentially a YouTube playlist to the public to say, here are the videos you need to watch? You have to go and watch Chris Lehto with Mike Carrera. You have to go watch Andy McGrillen speak to Avi Loeb. You know, and great for us, great for views, but these are the people, these are the scientists, these are the academics, their interviews are out there. And then what does that then say about or do to the rest who maybe aren't named?
I think the only thing that would move the needle in a lot of people's minds would be the president saying it. You know, your primary world leader of like China, the U.S. You know, if Putin said it, would anyone believe it in America? You know.
Well, I was going to ask you that, Chris. What happens in the States? Because we always talk about this, and I do as well. Like 60% of the audience that listen to this podcast or watch this are in the States. So, which is great. They understand what I'm saying. The idea that China or Russia, as we are speaking right now, Chris, one of them announces, do you know what? We have recovered a flying saucer. How does that impact the States, and what would they then do?
I don't know. That is a great question. You know, would they just continue to play dumb, or would they say, "Yes, it's true"?
Maybe reach out an olive branch and ask to share the science and say, "Oh, that's incredible. Let's look at that together."
I think nations are always going to do what they've done in the past. Look at mainstream science is always going to do what it did in the past. It's always going to ostracize the new thinkers. It's always going to lock them up. I think all we have to do to see how nations would react now is to look at how nations would react in the past. I think it's reproducible. So, and the best example I like is when I live in Portugal, when Portugal learned to go around the southern tip of Africa, right? They learned how to cut out the spice route, because the spice route was controlled. It was overland. It was controlled by the Muslims, their enemies essentially. So they had to trade with their enemies, who to get the spices, which would keep your food good over a long time, etc. And so they were all looking for a way to get to Asia, right? That's the reason they sent out Christopher Columbus, was to get to India, right, without having to go across land. Well, the Portuguese figured out that if you go really far west, all the way across the Atlantic Ocean, you can zoom around the southern tip of Africa. So they understood how to get to the New World. And there's no way in hell they shared that information with anyone. They didn't share it with the citizens in their own country. And they didn't share with people on the boats. They didn't tell the normal soldier on the boat how they were doing this. They didn't have access to the maps, etc. It was only the captains, only the navigators. So that information was kept secret because of, guess what, national security. So I'd say what would happen if, their enemy, Spain at the time, learned to go around the southern tip of Africa? My guess is they would not proclaim it to the world. So I think if I look at that, if I was to analyze that, I would say that China would not admit first that there is a crash retrieval program. They just wouldn't do it because they have an advantage. They know how to get to Asia, right? They know how to get to the New World, and their adversaries don't. So just like there's no way Spain told Portugal how they were getting to the Americas. There's no way they gave them maps to the Americas. I think it's the same thing. So I think David Grush is probably correct, is you have this secret war going on, just like nations did in the past, and it's about a new world, right? There's a new world around us of another frontier, and I think the nations are interacting in that world, and there's no way they're telling us, the local civilians, because they give up this huge advantage.
It's a great comparison. I like that. I appreciate that one. Dave asks on the stigma. So he says, I've been spending some time on the Newfork website, and some of the most compelling and documented cases are coming from pilots. Does Chris feel the stigma that has existed against pilots reporting events, which has existed for decades, is dissipating? And if so, can he elaborate as to how pilots are presently being told to handle events involving UAP?
I think it's trying to be dissipated, but we're not seeing any real change in the reporting. I don't think, at least I haven't seen any more evidence of UAPs being reported from military. And like we saw, the Navy said that no UAP stories can be FOIAble, right? They're not going to release any Freedom of Information Act requests related to UAPs. So if there is more accounts of UAPs being reported by pilots, we're not seeing it, at least. I haven't seen any of it publicly. And then privately, I mean, at least they know the terminology now. I talked to an Air Force pilot, it was a few years ago now, a buddy, but he at least knew about UAPs. And it sounds like they at least had like briefing items. But the military is a slow moving boat. It's difficult to move the ship. It takes a while. So you can, the civilian world, they try to get the military to accept homosexualities, right? And so they can impose whatever rules and laws they want, but the military usually tries to not accept them. I mean, it's a strong culture. So at least we've seen Congress try and get UAP or pilots to report UAPs, but we've also seen Congress try to protect whistleblowers, and they've been unsuccessful. So I know there's been efforts to get pilots to speak about it to avoid the stigma, but I haven't seen any actual results that it's getting any traction.
And from pilots to journalism, anonymous, and that is the name of the user, the state of UAP journalism. So what is the state of UAP journalism? What does meaningful journalism in the UAP topic look like? How should it evolve? There's enough being reported across outlets large and small that it now seems possible to ask such a question. On one hand, you have journalists following traditional best practices, Keane, Blumenthal, Knapp. On the other hand, you have Geraldo Rivera like talking heads. Does the field need to button up its game by dropping all the innuendo and the sources tell me type stuff and establish a higher standard in order to elevate the UAP topic in the public consciousness?
A higher standard. Well, I think maybe thanks Anonymous for writing. I don't know if there's a higher standard in regular journalism. It seems like the reporting I see is often one-sided. It's very often biased. It's been corrupted by organizations. I mean, the CIA's caught red-handed in the past, manipulating. Even topics I follow, you can see blatant lies. So I think our main journalism is not to a very high standard. I would love to see a higher standard across all of journalism. And if you look at freedom and safety of journalists, the US ranks extremely low. Last I checked, this was a few years ago, it was like number 43 in the world in journalistic freedom. So overall, I would love to see a higher journalistic standard, but that's across all of journalism. But I think what we're seeing is what you talked at the beginning or earlier about is that now you can have direct source access. So I don't think we can trust any single source anymore, or if you ever could. Even a video comes out and it shows exactly a UAP or an alien, no one will trust it. It can't be provable. I investigated a case in Australia. Ross Coulthart helped me. He met with the guy, did a background check on him, interviewed him, said he was legitimate. The video was fantastic. And no one believed it. Immediately they said it's lying. We're all grifters. The guy's lying. And people asked, where's the HD video? And I was like, and I titled the thumbnail, here's the HD video, and immediately got just hammered. So I don't think any single source is going to matter. I think the only thing that'll really move the needle is direct source of the same event from multiple different cameras, multiple different perspectives. If we could get a Phoenix Lights event again, but now we have 100 different people, from different places videoing, live streaming it at the same time. I think I would love to see that level of event, so I take everything with a grain of salt. I trust people like you and me more than I trust anyone that works in a journalistic avenue or is paid by any sort of company. So I don't know. How do you separate fact and fiction? I think it's very difficult.
I agree that the overall standards of journalism, even from local reporting all the way to the very top, has dropped incredibly. I think social media and engagement and the death of physical media, and that includes newspapers and whatnot, has contributed to that. There's a huge drop-off across the board. I think I tend to trust individuals who are comfortable using the phrase, in my opinion. I trust more, and people who are comfortable saying, I don't know, or even admitting when they're wrong, to a lot of folks who report, and if you just want to use the UFO topic, who are very hard and fast. I am saying this and this is right. I have an issue with that, because unless you're going to back it up, it's difficult to get fully on board, but I'm always willing to listen to people and take them at face value. But for me, there's, I think, a lack of, I think across the board, the phrase, in my opinion, isn't used often enough. And I try consciously to do that myself and not force what I think or what I believe or what I've heard on other people. And they should always make up their own mind. I think it was, I've said before, wrestler Scott Hall, who was Razor Ramon back in the day, folks, in WWF, had a really intelligent guy. he had a great phrase around, listen to everyone's opinion, or he said advice at the time, but listen to everyone's advice, but make up your own mind. And I think that should be the same across the UFO topic and everything else as well. Listen to who you want. Listen to Chris, listen to me, listen to Greer, Elizondo, Nat, Mellon, whoever. But make up your own mind, from the sum of the evidence that you see fit.
Well, there's also this viewpoint that like the world is falling apart, and like you mentioned there, that the standard of journalism has fallen. But I kind of am under the belief, in my opinion, that it's always been that way, or maybe even worse in the past. But now we just actually have insight to what's going on below the initial level. I think you had more centralization in the past. Like I mentioned already, the CIA, Project Mockingjay, they had CIA operatives inside many newsrooms, all sending out the same stories. You've had countless wars in the past, all the evil things. How many governments has the CIA overthrown? I mean, it's in the dozens to 100. So I don't think the world is necessarily any worse off than it was. If not, it's even better. The difference is you and I have access to way more information. So now we know. Like before, we assumed that this is how it was. Like our hero was the state, or growing up, my hero was mainstream science, and then I met my hero and saw it was a bunch of bullshit, essentially. So I don't know. I tend to think that we're just getting, we're peering behind the curtain based on decentralized information.
Last couple of questions. Kate asks for some advice facing ontological shock. What would Chris's advice be for those about to face their personal ontological shock coming across the many layers of the UAP field awareness?
Well, it's good to know that you're in the aware that you're about to encounter ontological shock. Usually it's just kind of like looking in the rearview mirror of some sort of crazy event. Yeah, well, I would say that life is a crazy thing, right? What could be a totally depressing existence, waking up and you ask yourself why you're alive, to just a few months later being extremely happy and grateful every day you wake up. It can drastically change, and does drastically change your viewpoints. If your viewpoint stays the same throughout life, I would say that's very boring, and that's kind of depressive. So I'd say now I'm much happier being on the other side of ontological shock. Yes, it was difficult going through it, but I would say more knowledge is better, and changing your perspective is a good thing, right? And if you're wrong, you can always change your perspective back. It's not like it's some sort of permanent condition. We always assume that we're in some permanent condition, but we're not, right? You're going to change. You're going to be a different person in a year than you are now that you were a year ago. And so just based on my own personal experience with this crazy topic and going through crazy experiences and Kundalini awakenings and everything, I'm very relaxed, very optimistic. I have zero fear of death. I have zero fear of loss. I don't. Maybe I'm just I've gone to a neutral, boring existence or something. But no, I think we don't understand reality, and I'd say anyone that says that they fully understand reality is wrong. And I think it's grander. It's certainly, for me, it's much grander and deeper and more complex than I assumed it was growing up. And so I don't know, I get the impression I've been here many times before, and I'll be here many times again. And if the US falls, which it surely will, right? Every nation will fall, every nation will die. It'll be fine. And if planet Earth fails and dies, I'm sure it will, right? Every planet will die sooner or later. It's a part of this universe. That'll be fine. There will be other planets, I guess. So I would say I'm much happier on the other side of the ontological shock.
And final question is on your overall hypotheses. So from Purple Rain, watched both of you more or less since your beginning, so thank you for that. I'm always most interested in what kind of working hypothesis you and Chris have as of right now, about the entire phenomenon and the universe at large. I know this is a work in progress. Thank you. All the best from Austria, Mira.
Yeah, I love that question. But I'm curious on you, Andy. How would you answer that question, I guess, before me?
Oh, God.
We weren't ready.
So the phenomenon and the universe at large. So I'll take that in two parts. Universe, we don't understand it. I don't think it's a big empty space, largely with some planets and galaxies that just fill it in now and again. I don't pretend to understand the whole simulation hypothesis thing, but I don't think we're plugged into the matrix, if people think that in terms of simulation. But the idea that this is all just a really complex system, I think things are there deliberately. I don't think it's God with a capital G. I don't think there's a magic man creator that started it all. But I do think there's a lot of weird and wonderful science we don't know and might never know that created it. There are probably different universes. If you go down the Marvel route of things, probably something along those lines that intersect. And I think an element of what we see to then cross into the phenomenon side of things is we've got a whole load of different phenomenon. I think now and again we've had alien races from other planets come here. I think that's probably been far less frequent than people might think. I think we've had drones or probes from other planets crash here, which have been recovered unmanned, which are probably more frequent. And then I think we have an element of different dimensionalities and whatnot coming through to here that keep an eye on us for various reasons. As a third, and the fourth one, I imagine a lot of what the US is encountering in terms of the tic-tac and everything else are potentially remnants of something that either was here and left or disappeared a long time ago and left behind technology to kind of keep an eye on things, a little bit like Wall-E was left behind to clean up Earth, except something left behind more than likely under the water, the means to manufacture probes and drones von Neumann style, and perhaps that's what some of these tic-tacs and such are. Bit waffly, but I think that's kind of where I'm at with things.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, well, to the asker, thanks for watching us for so long. Yeah, I think, well, and I keep mentioning it, but I am really in the final draft of my book. I'm calling it The Fractal Universe, How Patterns Repeat from Cells to Galaxies. And so I've mentioned it a few times before, but I take a systems approach to this. I think we'll find that the universe is fractal in nature. I think people have mentioned that a lot, and I mean that by as above, so below, like the ancient Hermetic principle. So I think we found, related to the UAP phenomenon, when we originally found microscopic life, that was in 1683, when it was proven by this Dutch guy, Antoine van Leeuwenhoek, and he ground these little lenses, and he could see the first little animalcules, they called them, but little cells, in pond water. Just took a drop of pond water, and he could see, tons of little animals moving around. And so that's when we really knew there was life below our dimensional level, and microscopic life. But still, and I mentioned how long it'll take for us to understand and get disclosure and all that. From that time, 1683, it took 200 years before doctors started washing their hands. So they knew there was these tiny little animals. You could see them. So they should have put this together. But for 200 years, they still attributed all these strange effects. All the sickness, infection, what the human body's actually made up of, right? We're made up of little cells. We learned that. So all of that stuff they attributed to spiritual things, miasmas. They said there were it was bad air, or it was evil spirits, right? When someone sneezes, we still say, God bless you, right? Because, the idea is that no evil spirit will enter you and make you sick. So it took 200 years, right? And during that time, we attributed normal things that with a real physical meaning to supernatural things. And so I think my argument is that we don't stop at our dimension of life. We just continue up. So I said systems approach. So the argument is we are actual little tiny cells in larger living entities. So I think any alien non-human intelligence that we could possibly interacting with now, there's no reason to believe it's at our dimensional level in size, meaning human size. Even David Grush, when he said biologics, he talked about biologics and said that he doesn't know if they were ever alive. Right. So that gives me the impression that they could be just like animatronic dolls of some other entity, right? Some other dimensional intelligence or consciousness. A lot of them have said like the ship's alive. Matthew Wygant, he said he always thought the ship was actually communicating with him. Or Jake Barber's carrying around that container, and he has the NHI encounter with like the goddess or something. I argue that it's quite obvious to me, at least, that there's macroscopic life on our planet. It follows the same rules of evolution, kill or be killed. I've made a couple references in this talk about, how would a nation react? And we even talk about nations as entities, right? How would China react? How would the US react if China did this? So we even refer to them as organisms in their own right. So I think from my perspective, it's obvious that there's macroscopic life, that we're a part of it. And I think we could be seeing those same type of strange interactions, that they saw with microscopic life, and they attributed to some weird supernatural effect that they didn't understand. And so I think the UAP phenomenon is related to that, is a deeper understanding of the reality of the universe, that we are part of a fractal nature. And in that sense, where is consciousness? Where does consciousness live in that? If I'm conscious and you're conscious, if that's true, right? All I can prove is that I'm having an experience. You could be fake for all I know in the simulation. But what about the cells in your body, right? Or we talked about pets. Is your dog conscious? I believe my dog is having some sort of experience. I see him dreaming and kicking and licking in his dream. I believe that he has a conscious experience. So where does that stop? Does a cell in your body, is it having a conscious experience? And then is the US having a conscious experience? Is Gaia, the planet, having a conscious experience? So I'd say we can't even answer that. We can't even begin to answer that question. Our current science they don't even have an experiment. It's like string theory I mentioned before. Our current science has no experiment to test for consciousness. We have no definition of pain. We see it as receptors, right? We know that, this nerve ending is firing, but why does that transition to actual experience of pain? And our current science has no understanding of that. So I see in the near future with help of AI, is that we're going to have many breakthroughs across all these different fields. And we're going to realize, in my opinion, that we're actually a part of a spectrum of life that goes up and down in our universe, and we're connected. And the reason why these UAP events or NDE events, they talk about, it's a connection, it's someone I knew, somehow we're related. I think somehow we are a part of them, through big or small. So I don't know. That's my general thinking on the subject now.
I like it. I would almost call it a little bit of magic school bus theory for me to understand it.
Yeah.
I like the idea. Remember the end of Men in Black, where the long enough for spoilers now, aren't we? We're 30 years out from the original.
Yeah.
Like the galaxy's on Orion's belt, and then it zooms in, and the cat's got the galaxy, and then it goes into the galaxy, and we're just part of a marble some aliens playing with elsewhere, and we think everything's massive, but really we're just tiny little organisms inside something else, and it just goes up and up and up. So yeah, I could totally buy into anything along those lines. And even the idea some of these objects are in some way, shape or form a defense mechanism, like antibodies, potentially. And are we the disease, or are they just coming to check on things? I don't know.
There's one final thought I had today is I mentioned the evolution, right? Well, if you look at a seed, right? If you plant a seed into the ground, will that seed sprout right away? And I'd say no, right? If a seed sprouts and the conditions aren't perfect, right? It doesn't have enough water in the region right around it. There's not enough resources. It's not close enough to the surface. Then that seed will not turn into a tree, right? So over time, the seed has evolved to where it will wait, right? It has certain control mechanisms involved to where it will only sprout when the conditions around the seed are correct, right? It has enough moisture, it has enough soil, it has enough access to the surface, there's enough pressure from the dirt, etc. And then the seed will sprout. And so I kind of think of that as the disclosure movement, is that it could be that we're one of billions of worlds, right? And that as it feels now, the world is going through many people have said a great awakening. It's certainly rapidly changing, rapidly evolving. I think for the first time, the whole planet is in communication of some type with the internet. And now we have AI and all these new technologies coming on board. So I think people can feel that amazing rapid change is going on. So it could be that we're not meant to know about the disclosure. We're not meant to know about the technologies, meaning we're not going to see a big breakthrough. We're not going to see a real sprout of the planet until the system, the environment is correct. And I think that could be why we're kept in the dark, is that the environment is not yet ready, even though we're ready, right? But the seed is ready. It feels like it's ready to burst. But I think the environment is just not letting it quite yet, because the system, there's control systems that say, no, not yet. If you have disclosure right now, you'll destroy yourselves. Right now you're not ready. You'll blow apart the planet. The environment's not correct. So I kind of feel like maybe there is a system holding us in until we're ready.
Yeah, I like that. Good answer. And just to finish off, Chris, I mentioned before we recorded, I just want your thoughts, quick as you like, on a couple of issues we've not touched on here. One of them is a story that I've not followed, but I know you have on your channel. The whole pyramid, hidden structure underneath the pyramid story. Can you give us a little bit of what's going on there and why it's something you feel is worth following?
Yeah, definitely. I'm very excited about the story. So basically, Filippo Biondi, he is a SAR scientist, which is synthetic aperture radar. He's a specialist. He's from Italy, and he's been working on this technology for many years. And they use it from space, essentially, to sense little micro vibrations in the ground. And he's been able to use the technology for bridges, so they can tell there's little cracks in bridges before they fall. You can also tell from volcanoes. So you can actually use the micro vibrations on the surface to listen, if you will, acoustically below the ground, which is what they do for earthquakes, right? You get seismic. When there's an earthquake, actually, you're listening to the waves, the P and S waves, and you're triangulating where the earthquake was, et cetera, and the strength. So in 2022, he wrote a paper where he converted this technology, again, in his basement. Okay, it wasn't from mainstream science. It was this dude in his garage, doing these tests, to where he wrote in this paper that he could see into the Great Pyramid and actually map out all these little structures inside the Great Pyramid. And so he argues there's many more rooms than what we know about. That was peer-reviewed science and ignored, essentially. And then this year, he said, okay, below the pyramid, actually, we can use this technology to sense up to 2 kilometers below the ground. And so they sensed all these pillars. I'm sure your audience has seen, it did make mainstream news, about these pillars going down 1.2 kilometers below the pyramids. And he was ostracized, right? Immediately mocked. So came out with that. And Sabine Hassenfelder, again, another science educator. I don't know how much science she actually does. I know she makes YouTube videos just like I do. She said 9 out of 10, it was bullshit. And Filippo was you could tell he was offended by that. I think he respects her, or he met his hero, I guess, in that instance. And so now they're just continuing on. And the best part of this is the technology's out there. So he already relayed the basic how-to of the plan. He showed it. He showed the experiment in his garage. So if it's true, and from a physics perspective, there's nothing to say it can't be true. Okay, they've used this technology to listen to windows with lasers and during the Cold War. And so the best part is it can't be hidden. So it doesn't matter. It's going to come out because it's too lucrative. The technology is way too lucrative to the oil and gas industry. It's too lucrative to mining if you're able to determine where actual minerals are underground easily from space, just space radar. It's definitely going to come out. So we'll know sooner or later if it's true. And even if they've already shown it in many examples that it's correct, right? And people still think it's not true. But if they can prove it in other places, now it doesn't matter. We don't need to go below the pyramids to learn what's underneath there. We'll be able to see right now. And the same is true, which I'm sure national security is going to be affected. You'll be able to see below Area 51, for instance. There's nothing holding anyone back except for the U.S. government. But those scans have most likely already been done. So the data's out there, and you can't stop China from SAR analyzing Area 51.
Yeah.
But even then, avoid that issue because that's very prickly. You could scan Göbekli Tepe. You can look under that. You can look under Peru. So there's many places around the Earth that if you could scan accurately 2 kilometers below the ground, I mean, you're going to rewrite our whole understanding of the ancient world and ancient history. So it's very exciting from my perspective.
Would that work under ice as well, if you wanted to go to Antarctica, say, and scan below the ice?
I asked on ice. He said he wasn't sure. There are limitations. Like, it won't work right now below a big city. It works because any little vibration is going to cause interference. So that's why it works really well on the Giza Plateau. If you actually go and look at the scans over Cairo, which is right next to the pyramids, it's like a mess. There's a ton of noise. And then if you look at the pyramids, it's flat desert. So there's minimal noise. But he also said he can see through the water table, although it attenuates it. So in the scans that go below the pyramid, I don't know, maybe like 200 meters down, he said that's where the water table is because actually it's attenuated. So above that, he was getting more signal, and below that, he was getting less signal. So I think there's certainly a possibility it can scan through ice, but I wouldn't be surprised if they couldn't either because of, I don't know, the lattice structure of ice or something. Okay. So he said there are limitations.
I know there's folks interested in that, and it's one I kind of keep an eye on from a distance. Quick thoughts on Ross Coulthart recently saying that the Tic Tac technology was Lockheed Martin, and he knew that for certain.
Yeah, I kind of agree with what you say. If anyone says they know something for certain, I'm skeptical, And I mentioned David Fravor as well, where I tend to agree directly with David Fravor. If he says at that time there's no way that could be created by man, any technology he knew about, then I would tend to trust David Fravor, obviously. And if Ross Coulthart says he's certain of it, I still had questions on why they would be operating in that area. Why did they have 18 to 20 Tic Tacs in the area as well? Was there a squadron of Tic Tacs? Why would they operate that close to a known carrier group? The carrier group is there. There's just so many whys. It doesn't make any sense to me that I've said from the beginning, it doesn't make sense to me that it's a U.S. craft. My big question is why would you could easily just operate it at night. Whatever operation you had to do, or do it further away, or when the aircraft are approaching, when David Fravor's F-18s are approaching, just leave the area. So none of it makes sense to me from a Lockheed Martin craft. But I'll listen to what he says. I'm curious what his evidence is, and it certainly puts pressure on Lockheed Martin.
And finally, have you followed the Nazca mummies story closely, and what are your thoughts there?
I haven't followed it closely because I felt the only way I could really learn more about it was to see it in person, investigate it, really boots on the ground. And it's just on the other side of the world. It's in Mexico. I'm in Europe with you. But I did interview Jesse Michaels, and he went and saw the mummies in person. And he said he's actually coming out with a documentary in the near future. I think he's finalizing it, and there is new information being released. So it's a very interesting case. I'm definitely interested in it. Right when it came out, I asked Leslie Kane what she thought, and she was skeptical of it, only because it's Jaime Maussan has a very bad reputation in the UFO world. I know when Jesse met him in person, he didn't get that impression at all. He said he thinks he's dedicated. He thinks he's truthful. He may just put out whatever information he finds without being discerning. That may be one of his issues. But overall, I'm happy that there's people looking into it. It's not me.
Yeah, it's one again. I've got someone coming on tomorrow, but when people listen to this, the interview will be out and recorded. It's someone who's been documenting and filming and been out to see the objects as well. So be interested to get another perspective on it. But listen, Chris, been wonderful speaking with you. In your final minutes left here, what can people do to check out you, your content, and where can they find you online?
Yeah, the best place is on my YouTube channel, Lehto Files. And I also put those YouTube videos out on audio. So competing with you on your very successful audio podcast as Lehto Files, so they can find that out. And as always, support, Andy on Patreon and me on Patreon as well. Like I've said this whole time, we're the dudes in our basement. I think we're beholden to no one but ourselves. And so I think, if anything, you're going to get what we think is truthful, right? In our opinion, and not anyone else's. So please support us.
And that's good or bad, because we've got no one editing, chopping things up, or telling us what we can or can't put out. So yeah, any mistakes are on us, and all the good stuff's on us as well. Yep. So you kind of take the good and the bad, don't you?
You definitely do. Yep, exactly.
Awesome. Listen, thank you so much, Chris, for your time. Great speaking with you again. We'll try not leave it 2 years till the next one. And thank you, everyone else, for tuning in, for listening, for watching. And I'll speak to you very soon.
All right. Thank you, Andy. Great to chat again. Thanks, mate.
Your eyes keep looking over my shoulder. And for folks, spurious link on the audio side of things, this might not be ideal, but very quickly, I've actually got a hard copy of my book, folks. I'll do a little proper video for it online. So anyone looking in the background, that's the actual book. I have the real proper atlas of UFOs here, loads of maps, pictures, and there is text and stuff in there as well that I wrote. So if you've not pre-ordered it and plan on doing so, great time. It's real, it's an actual thing. Look, there you go. For the audio folks, that flick was the hard back of the book. So I'll do a proper little.
How do I get one of those? How do I get a signed?
How do you get a signed copy? Yeah, well, there's so many different ways. Nathan, I'm glad you asked to order. But what we'll do is we'll go through that at the end, okay? So I don't annoy folks right now tuning in for the actual UFO news. Go and shut the fuck up, Andy, and just get on with it. But yeah, ask me again at the end, Nathan. I can run through all those details with you. Good man.